So today we're going to be talking about modifying portraits, and basically we're going to take a few different varieties of portraits here, and we're going to transform them selectively using different masks, some local adjustments, and even some blending modes. And we'll start with this photograph here, and we'll just go into the browse module. I'm going to select the photograph, and to take it into the edit module, I'm just going to use the D key on my keyboard. Boom. So now I'm inside Photo RAW 2020 inside of the edit module. And to modify this portrait, basically we're going to go in here and we're going to adjust a few things inside of tone and color, but we're really going to focus on the creative side of the portraits today. So we're not going to really focus on too much of the tone and color. I'm definitely going to go over a few of the different sliders and things that I use, but for the most part, we're going to be modifying the basic look simply by using camera profiles. The first thing I want to do is just pull out a little bit of the life in the shot, and an easy way to do that is to use a camera profile. So inside my tone and color pane here, I can go into my camera profiles, and all I do is I just hover over these, and you can immediately get a nice sense of what sort of look you're going to go for on your shot. And with this particular portrait, I think I'm going to use this ON1 Vivid. So if I click on this, and I hit the / key on my keyboard, it does a really good job of just pulling out some of the life within the shot. It brightens some of these midtones, adds in some contrast. We're not stuck with this sort of flat looking image. And honestly, I probably don't need to do anything else inside of my develop tab. If I hit the / key on my keyboard again, I think that's pretty good for our just foundational look. We don't really have to do a whole lot. We can always go in and readjust throughout the edit, but I think this looks good for now. So now what I want to do is I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to go into my effects tab. I'm going to add a filter. And one thing I like to do with these portraits to add on style or to modify tonality really quickly is to use a LUT filter. Now, I know I use LUTs all the time, but you can use LUTs filters and you can use them with the blending mode, and you can target tones in your shot rather than actually modifying the color that kind of comes with those stylistic LUTs. So we're going to add a LUTs filter here. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here to these preset styles, and I'm going to go down here to throw, or what was it? Yeah, punch. So we'll just use punch in here. So I'm going to click on this punch one. And if I go in here, I can see that it's adding in sort of a blue color to the shot that I don't like, but I like what it does to sort of the contrast in the photo, and it brings out some of these midtones in the sky and whatnot. So what I can do to strictly apply this LUT filter to the tones in the shot and not modify the color is I can use the blend mode. So I'm going to go into my LUTs blending options here with this gear icon, and I'm going to go into my mode. And an awesome one for strictly applying your filter or adjustment to the luminance or the tones in your shot and not the color is this Luminosity Blend mode. So I'm just going to hover over that and I'll click it. And now if I turn this off and on, see how it's providing a ton of style into the shot, but it's not modifying any of the color at all. So what I can do here is I can just go over to this opacity and I can lower it or raise it up. And I basically have a preset style with this LUT filter, and it's modifying all of the tonalities of my shot, but it's not affecting the color at all. So I'll just modify the opacity a little bit, and I'm probably just going to leave it about right there. That looks pretty good, just like that. So if I hit the / key on my keyboard now, we've started with this, and in just a few different clicks, we're now at this stage in the edit. So with this particular image, I think what would be good is to bring sort of some context over here into the frame. Now, typically when we're shooting portraits, we have the person, wherever they're facing, whether they're facing left or right, we leave sort of a space there. Whereas with this portrait, there's a little bit of this chunk on the left, and then there's a whole huge chunk to the right, but she's not actually looking to the right on this image. So we're looking to the left. So what would look good on this shot is to bring in maybe a little bit of light into this area so that it makes it look like she's actually looking at something instead of just kind of staring off into the distance for no reason. And an easy way to bring in a little bit of light is to use a sun flare filter. So let's go in here, we'll add a filter, and we'll add the all new sun flare filter. Now with the sun flare filter, it's pretty intense. So you need to be careful, especially about which portraits or photographs you use it on. But I think with this shot, since there's a little bit of an overcast lighting to it, we could get away with it because we can go in and we can modify the tones of the sun flare. So inside of the sun flare filter, I'm going to click on this second preset option here, and that's going to apply it to the left side of my shot. Now with the sunflare filter, there's a bunch of different things you can use in the sunflare filter to modify your shot. But I would recommend focusing on this tone and color area if you're trying to put it on a portrait like this. The biggest thing about the sunflares that people get wrong is they add them to a shot like this and they leave the saturation at 0 or all the way up like this, and it looks wonky. We obviously don't have a ton of warm in the shot. We can always bring some in later, but this looks like it's sort of added on after the fact, and it's not given a lot of thought. But we can go to our tone and color inside of the sunflare filter, and I can pull back on the saturation, and you can see that it's blending in already a lot better with the scene because I'm removing that bright, warm color from the sunflare. Now, if I turn this off and on, I really like what it does to this area up top here and this area to the left, but it's covering up the model's face. So what we need to do is we need to apply the sunflare selectively, and we need to mask this out from her face. So an easy way to do that is just to hit B on your keyboard. That'll grab your masking brush. Then we're going to go up to our opacity, make sure it's at 100, make sure our feathering's at 100, and then I'm going to hit Z on my keyboard to go to my zoom tool. I'll just move in real quick, or zoom in real quick. Then I'll hit B. So now I have my masking brush selected. I'm going to change my mode to paint out by holding down Shift and hitting X on my keyboard. And then I'm just going to go in here, and I'm just going to remove this sunflare from the model here. And we don't have to be too perfect with painting it out, because we're going to come in here and kind of brush onto the edges a little bit with a glow filter, and that's going to kind of remove some of the harsh edges. So we'll just paint like that, and then we'll just remove this completely from the bottom, just like that. So we only really have it up top there. And then I'm going to lower my opacity a little bit on my brush, and I'm going to go in here to this hair, and I'm going to brush it out with a lower opacity, just so I'm not removing it 100% away right off the bat. So I can kind of blend it a bit more. There we go. So now if I head up here to my sunflare filter and I turn this off and on, I really like what that's doing to just bring a little bit of light into the shot right there. I think it's helping to kind of add some interest to the frame to the left side, because we have this really huge gap to the right and we have this sort of minimal gap to the left, but we can bring sort of a flow to the photograph by adding in some interest and then kind of leading the viewers around, and then they'll eventually kind of head to the right of the frame. So now what we need to do is, if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we're kind of setting the foundational tone for our entire photo. We've set the foundational look of our tonalities inside the Develop tab, and now we're just kind of bringing in that interest again to the left of the frame, and we've stylized with a LUT. So in setting this, this scene, we need to come in here and just bring a little bit more realism around our model with a glow filter. So we're going to add a filter here, and we're going to add a glow filter. Now, inside of this glow, the glow filter, basically you can use the glow filter to bring in sort of a soft halo-y glow to your shot. And it's really, really awesome on portraits, especially if you're using it to soften up kind of the edges. You can really bring in a backlit mood around hair by using the glow filter, and a lot of awesome other things with the glow filter. But the main thing we're going to focus on with this portrait using the glow filter is we're going to bring in some soft haloed edges kind of around her. And what that's going to do is that's going to sort of reinforce this idea that there's light coming here from the left of the shot. So let's go in here to this glow filter. And what we're going to do is we're going to choose a preset style. Now, inside the glow filter, there's basically two modifiers, your amount and your halo, and then your mode. So I would recommend going into the glow filter and using some presets. They have a lot of presets in here, and they're really awesome. But one of my favorites here is this Charge More Subtle. So if I choose this Charge More Subtle, I can see that it really glows the entire frame, and I don't like that at all. But if I take a look at what it does to her hair, it really kind of softens up the edges around her, and it makes it look a lot more realistic against this sort of backlit sun flare. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hit B on our keyboards. Oops, we need to go to our glow filter. So we're actually going to paint this on selectively using the paint in mode. So we're going to go to our glow filter, and in our masking options, we're going to invert this mask. So I'm inverting this mask, and by inverting the mask, I'm turning this entire thing to black with masking, white reveals, and black conceals. So we're concealing the mask. Now what we need to do is paint this in. So I'm just going to hold down Shift, hit X on my keyboard. That'll grab my paint in brush mode. Then I'll just lower the brush size with the bracket keys on my keyboard. And all I'm going to do now here is I'm just going to brush in here. Oops, I need to up the opacity a bit. So I'm just going to up the opacity to 100. Sorry about that. And then we're just going to go in here and we're just going to brush some of this glow filter around the edges, just like that. I'm actually going to paint this on her entire outfit right here. That's going to kind of dim that area down. But watch as I paint it on kind of her arms and stuff. It'll bring a nice bit of glow into those areas. So basically, I'm painting it around her face, leaving her face kind of how it is. And then I'm just painting it on her arms like that. So if I turn this glow filter off and on now, you can see it softens up this area and softens up that light on her face, and it looks a lot more natural using that glow filter. One thing that I would recommend doing is keep an eye on the highlights in the skin tones. You can kind of see in here, we've kind of blown these out. So what I'm going to do, so I'm going to see if I can remove this. There we go. So just remove that patch so it's not so intense on her forehead. So now if I turn this off and on, boom. So now one more thing, I guess there's a couple more things I want to do this shot, but if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard to kind of view where we're heading, we started with this and we're moving on to this photograph. And I really like how it's coming along. I think just a couple more things to tweak it would look really good. The next thing I want to do is just bring out a little bit of the midtones in the model here. So she's kind of standing out against this backdrop. The LUT we were using actually brought out a lot of these tones to the left over here, and then the sun flare filter brought out a lot of that brightness right there anyway. So what we need to do is just kind of bring her out of the frame a bit. So all I'm going to do in here is I'm going to add a filter. I'm going to add a curves filter, and then I'm just going to pull up on my midtones a bit. And you can see that that's pulling out the sort of brightness in her skin tones, and it's pulling her out of the frame a bit more. But we're going to apply this selectively, and we're only going to apply it to her. So let's head in here. And we'll go into our masking options here. And we're actually going to invert this mask, just like that. And then we're just going to paint this on real quick. So I'm going to hold down Shift, hit X on my keyboard. That'll grab me my masking brush set to paint in. And now with this curves filter with my midtone boost, kind of boosted up right there, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint this on. Just like that. So now if I turn this curves filter off and on, it really helps to just kind of liven that area up on our model. And we could even go in here and pull up on the midtones even more. And maybe even pull down on the contrast. Perfect. So now that we've brought out all of these kind of stylistic tones in the shot, if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, the more I'm looking at this shot, I think what we need to do to kind of finalize it is just warm it up. So let's head into our develop tab here, and let's head down to our color. And I think the last thing we need to do is just warm this up. So I'm going to go into my temperature. I'll make sure that the Kelvin is selected. Then I'll just click, and I'll pull it over. And that looks so much better like that, with just a little bit of warmth on it. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard to view our original shot, we've taken this portrait and we've used a few different develop sliders, we've used some effects, and we've used a local adjustment, and we've turned it into this photograph. Just like that. And one thing I think we could do is we could probably crop this a little bit. So if I hit C on my keyboard, we could easily use kind of a cinematic look. So I'll just pull this in a little bit, scoot this over onto her eye. So now we have a 16:9, which is sort of a movie-like ratio. And now if we hit enter, boom. Now it's a lot more of a cinematic frame. We've made this sort of stylistic cinematic look just by using a camera profile. Actually, we didn't even use any adjustments inside of the tone and color. We just used color. So backslash key on our keyboard, view original, and we've made that shot. We can move on to this portrait here. And one thing I would recommend with portraits like this is if we have sort of a really well exposed face, and then we have other areas on the image that are a little bit blown out. So if we look at this arm, you could tell that it's extremely blown out, but the face is still, you know, relatively perfectly exposed. There's not a whole lot of harsh contrast on here. There's a little bit of bright light, but other than that, it's a really well exposed face. Well, with images like this, I would recommend zooming in on the actual face and then edit your portrait. So now we're looking at strictly this face, and then we're going to be modifying our tone and color. And the reason that I like to do this is this allows me to focus on the face and not get distracted by the other brighter areas. Because when we do pull up on sliders and modify different sliders, it's going to be modifying our image as a whole. So with this tone and color pane, I'm going to stare at this face and then modify these sliders, and that will help me strictly adjust these tones, and then I can go back and I can adjust kind of the other areas later. So first things first, with this portrait, we're going to set our foundational look. And let's try a camera profile first. I'm going to head down here. Let's see if any of these work really well. No, ON1 standard looks about right. So I'm just going to click ON1 standard here. And one thing about this portrait that I think would make it stand out a little bit is kind of pulling back on those highlights and removing some of those brighter areas, and then pulling up on the midtones and then adding in contrast. So all I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to hold down my J key, and I'm going to modify my exposure to just see where my exposure's at. Basically, I'm just going to pull up on it until I see true white. So that's blown out on the photograph. So now I know that I have a lot of room I can work with, so I can pull this back to about there, maybe even about a stop right there, maybe even a little less. And now I don't have any of these blown out areas on her cheek right there. But what I've done now is I've removed all the exposure from her face. So I have to go in and I have to pull up on my midtones, and that's going to pull out those middle grays, and that'll bring back more brightness to her skin tone. So if I pull up on my midtones here, now I'm adding in skin tones to the shot, but I'm not modifying the exposure as a whole. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard now, see how it's a subtle move, but it really kind of tames these bright highlights in her face. So now what we should do is just go down here. We're going to pull up on our shadows just a little bit. Just a hair. Like that. And now what we need to do is we need to add in some contrast. So by pulling up on our midtones and our shadows, we're pulling away from the contrast of our photograph. So let's go up here and we're going to click on our contrast slider. I'm going to hold down the J key on my keyboard. That's going to show me my clipping warnings, and then I'll add in some true black, just enough true black, probably about right. Probably about right there. That looks pretty perfect. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we're just, again, not doing anything too crazy to this shot. We're really just kind of harnessing these tones and making sure they're not too blown out on the image. Okay, so maybe even probably just a little bit more of a mid-tone boost. Perfect. All right, so now we've set the foundational look for the face here, but we have all of these other blown out areas around her. So a quick fix that I like to use in this step in the post-processing is I'll head into my local adjustments tab, and in this local adjustment layer, I'll make sure it's set to darken, and I like to create sort of a custom vignette, and I've done this on a lot of my webinars and tutorials in the past, but this is an awesome, awesome way to tone down areas around your portrait. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and hit K on my keyboard. That's going to grab my adjustable gradient. And now in my shape menu, I'm going to head down to Center. And the Center shape menu is basically going to take this adjustable gradient, and it's going to apply the local adjustment to the center of, if I drop this down, it's basically going to apply this local adjustment everywhere around the center of my photograph, and it's going to protect the center of this mask so that I can kind of modify this and fine tune it just around her face. So I'm just going to pull this in really, really tight to her eyes like that. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out on these perforated edges a little bit. And then maybe I can move this a little bit like that. So now take a look at these areas on our photograph. Obviously, we can't go in and fix all of that. That's really, really blown out. That's kind of beyond fixing. But what we can do is we can kind of tone it down. So keep an eye on this area, and now I'll zoom out. And if I turn this adjustment off and on, see how that does an awesome job of just toning down this area, but we can still see that nice bright exposure on her face. So that's all from this local adjustment layer, really helping us out in just toning down the areas around our model. So we have the backslash key on our keyboard. We're kind of swapping the light from her hand and putting it onto her face. So with this particular image or a shot like this, I would probably recommend just stylizing it quickly. You don't really need to do too much to this photograph. What we can do here is we can go into our effects tab. I'll add a filter, and we'll just go in here and use a split tone filter. I really like these split tone filters for portraits, because if you want to add some warmth to the shot, you can use your split toning to add in warmth, or if you want to add in some coolness, you can bring in this cool preset style. But a lot of these filters, or a lot of these presets inside of the split tone, they add sort of a mild look on your shot. So you can get away with using these on a lot of portraits because they're not very intense like a LUT or like a vintage filter. So if I go in here, a lot of these, you can see they're just really subtle, but they bring in sort of a nice bit of color. And one of my favorites here is this warm. And I really like this warm style here because it allows me to modify kind of the warmth and the highlights and then add in some coolness to the shadows. But I'm actually going to head down to my mode here. And to take off that kind of faded look, I'm actually going to go down here to lighten. So I have this sort of, well, I didn't remove the faded. We'll click on color. There we go. So I've removed that faded look by hitting color instead of normal. So now you can see it's really toning down these highlights in her face. So if I turn this off and on here, it's bringing in sort of a coolness to the shot that we didn't have before. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, there we go. We started with this photograph, and now we've turned it into this shot just by using a few different adjustments and a split tone filter. And I know it's very subtle, but most of the time when you're editing portraits, if you get the shot right in the first place, you really don't have to add too much onto the photograph. I was recently watching an interview with Alan Shaler, who's an awesome, awesome black and white photographer, and he likened editing to adding on varnish to your table. He said that the table's already built. You just basically have to go in and add kind of the varnish onto it to set the look. You don't have to do too much to the table already because it's already built, but just adding on that varnish will help make it look the best. And for this particular portrait, I really liked using this portrait to add in light selectively. So this is gonna be a fun one to kind of go in and really just harness the power of all of this light hitting his face. And to kind of bring out the most out of the shot without actually modifying any sliders, we're gonna go into our camera profile menu, and I'm gonna choose ON1 neutral. So by clicking on ON1 neutral, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it does a good job of just pulling out some of the tones in the shot. It's not a crazy, crazy bright photograph by doing that, but it does help it a lot, kind of just pulling out some of these tones within the photo. So now within the shot here, one thing that we could do is basically just pull out some of these tones and set a foundational look. So I'm going to go down here first to my midtones, and I'm just going to pull those out a little bit, just like that. And then I'm going to head down to my contrast slider, and I'm just going to pull that up a little bit. And I'm just kind of creating this fine balance between the light hitting his face right here and then the contrast of the darkness on the other side of it. So we don't want it too dark over here, but we don't want it too bright over here. So we're just kind of using these sliders to kind of perfect this look. So now one thing we could do is we could go in here, and I'm just going to pull up on the whites a little bit like that so it's not so flat. And then I'll pull up on my shadows a hair. I think that looks pretty good. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. Perfect. So I think that looks pretty good as far as just the foundational look of the shot. Now to kind of bring out the tone selectively, we're going to go in here to our local adjustment tab. I'm going to add an adjustment. Oh, I already added an adjustment. So with this local adjustment layer here, I'm going to make sure it's set to darken. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and K on my keyboard. And then I'm going to go up to my shape here, and I'm going to choose Reflected Gradient. Now with Reflected Gradient, it's going to allow me to reflect this local adjustment layer on each side. So I can add darkness here, and I can add darkness here. So if I drop this down, I can use this small handle to flip this, but you can see I have a darkened local adjustment layer on this side, and I have one on this side as well. So I'm just going to move this little line right there, and then I'll feather this quite a bit. And then I'll leave that one there, and then I'll feather this one quite a bit. So now if I turn this local adjustment layer off and on, it does a good job of darkening up that frame. So now I'll just pull back on the midtones a little bit, and probably the shadows. So we have a bit darker of an area, and we're really kind of just honed in on this light right there. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we're really focusing on the light a lot better than we were before, and the image is really starting to come together. One filter that I want to add that will bring in a lot of life to the shot is the sunshine filter. So if I go into effects and I add a filter, if I add the sunshine filter, what it's going to do is it's going to darken the darks and it's going to brighten the brighter areas. So by doing that, if I turn this off and on here, you can see it does an awesome job of really, again, just kind of reinforcing the light on his face, so we're really kind of focused on that area and nowhere else on the frame. So I think if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard now, I think we only need to add maybe one last filter to this shot. So I'm just going to add a filter. I'm going to add a LUT filter real quick, and I'm just going to go in here, and I'll choose, which one is it? The black and white looks pretty good too. We could probably leave it at that black and white, but there was one I was looking at earlier that looked, oh, that one's pretty good, that comfort one. Let's leave it with that one. And then I'm going to go in here, and I'm actually going to modify the blending mode. So I have this look right here. If I turn this off and on here, I really like what that does to kind of bring in some more light and then kind of bringing in this bright light right there. But I don't really like the kind of faded look to the shot. So I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to click on my blending options, and I'm going to go down to luminosity again. So if I hit this on the, or if I turn this off and on now, see how it just pulls in a little bit of light in here, and then again kind of darkens this area up some more. So we're really just focused on his face now and nowhere else on the shot. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we're really just transforming the light on his face just to focus on this area. So we're not really concerned about anywhere else. And it does a really good job, especially with this photograph, because if we had a photograph where there wasn't sort of this bright light hitting the side of his face, it would look a little bit wonky, but it does look really good with this particular portrait.